Oh, come in, come in. Come in. Oh, hello, nice to see you again. Come on, close the door and draw up a chair. Well, you see, I'm back from Switzerland. It was wonderful that you could catch up with me in the Lothlórien, and we could think about how it inspired Tolkien's Rivendell. It's a great trip, but it's good to be back, back to my home comforts. I got out that beautiful little Jason Patrick artisan pipe that you saw me lighting for the first time a while back. Well, it's too precious to take on my travels, so it's nice to be reunited with it. I've got a drop of Lagavulin, I think almost my favourite. Single malt. Do pour yourself a drop. So, last time we chatted, we were in Lothlórien, and we were thinking about that beautiful valley and about Rivendell. And so I thought if we were dipping still into Tolkien, we could look at the journey on from Rivendell. You know, in the mountains and cruel Caradhras and the snowy peaks, which are all there. As you look out Lothlórien, you see the three great peaks of the Alps. But I don't know, so I thought I want to go to another. The old Latin poets had a beautiful phrase. It talked about a locus amenus, a beautiful, amenable, lovely place. There was a whole genre of poetry describing a locus amenus. Well, the other obvious thing at the other side of that journey, when they try to go over the mountains and can't, and then go down into Khazad Dûm and under the mountains and come up, obviously is Lothlórien, and we've read a bit of Lothlórien, the sense of being in another world and a different time. So I was just skimming through, and I came upon a passage which I think I'd forgotten, but I hadn't realised how important it is. It's a moment, actually, of tension. You remember, Lothlórien is a guarded realm. I mean, it's got an enchantment on it, but it's surrounded by potential enemies, and there's quite a kerfuffle about letting them in, and they have to be blindfolded and all of that. So let's get a bit more going on this pipe. Right, better. And the elves, because of the long and sometimes difficult history between elves and dwarves, and they're very different, so are quite reluctant about bringing a dwarf in. But then eventually they get to the centre of it, and they meet the Lord and the Lady of Lothlórien, Celeborn and Galadriel. And there, of course, they have to share the terrible news about the death as they think, the loss, the fall of Gandalf, defying the Balrog for them. And it's a remarkable scene, and it's remarkable because of it almost goes very badly wrong, and it's set right again by the sheer grace of Galadriel. This is the scene, you remember it well, I'm sure. The Lord is Celeborn here. When all the guests were seated before his chair, the Lord looked at them again. "Here are 8, he said. 9 were to set out, so said the message. But maybe there has been some change of counsel that we have not heard. Elrond is far away, and darkness gathers between us, and all this year the shadows have grown longer." "Nay, there was no change of counsel," said the Lady Galadriel, speaking for the first time. Her voice was clear and musical, but deeper than woman's wont. "Gandalf the Grey set out with the company, but he did not pass the borders of this land. Now tell us where he is, for I much desired to speak with him again. But I cannot see him from afar unless he comes within the fences of Lothlórien. A grey mist is about him, and the ways of his feet and of his mind are hidden from me." "Alas," said Aragorn, "Gandalf the Grey fell into shadow. He remained in Moria and did not escape." At these words, all the elves in the hall cried aloud in grief and amazement. These are evil tidings, said Celeborn, the most evil that have been spoken here in long years, full of grievous deeds. He turned to Haldir. Why was nothing of this been told to me before, he asked in the elven tongue. We have not spoken to Haldir of our deeds and our purposes, said Legolas. At first we were weary and danger was too close behind, and afterwards we almost forgot our grief for a time, as we walked in gladness on the fair paths of Lorien. Yet our grief is great, and our loss cannot be mended, said Frodo. Gandalf was our guide, and he led us through Moria, and when our escape seemed beyond hope, he saved us, and he fell. Tell us now the full tale, said Celeborn. Then Aragorn recounted all that had happened upon the pass of Caradhras and in the days that followed, and he spoke of Balin and his book, and the fight in the chamber of Marzabul, and the fire, and the narrow bridge, and the coming of the terror. An evil of the ancient world, it seemed, such as I have never seen before, said Aragorn. It was both a shadow and a flame, strong and terrible. It was a Balrog of Morgoth, said Legolas, of all elfbanes the most deadly, save the one who sits in the dark tower. Indeed, I saw upon the bridge that which haunts our darkest dreams. I saw Durin's bane, said Gimli in a low voice, and dread was in his eyes. Alas, said Celeborn, we long have feared that under Caradhras a terror slept. But had I known that the dwarves had stirred up this evil in Moria again, I would have forbidden you to pass the northern borders, you and all that went with you. And if it were possible, one would say that at the last Gandalf fell from wisdom into folly, going needlessly into the net of Moria. He would be rash indeed that said that thing, said Galadriel gravely. Needless were none of the deeds of Gandalf in life. Those that followed him knew not his mind, and cannot report his full purpose. But however it may be with the guide, the followers are blameless. Do not repent of your welcome to the dwarf. If our folk had been exiled long and far from Lothlórien, who of the Galadrim, even Celeborn the Wise, would pass nigh and not wish to look upon their ancient home, though it had become an abode of dragons? Dark is the water of Kelad-Zaram, and cold are the springs of Kibil-Nala, and fair were the many-pillared halls of Khazad-dûm in elder days, before the fall of mighty kings beneath the stone. She looked upon Gimli, who sat glowering and sad, and she smiled. And the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw there love and understanding. Wonder came into his face, and then he smiled in answer. He rose clumsily and bowed in dwarf fashion, saying, Yet more fair is the living land of Lorien, and the Lady Galadriel is above all the jewels that lie beneath the earth. There was a silence. At length Celeborn spoke again. I did not know that your plight was so evil, he said. Let Gimli forget my harsh words. I spoke in the trouble of my heart. I will do what I can to aid you, each according to his wish and need, but especially that one of the little folk who bears the burden. I think that's a really remarkable piece of writing. You may also remember that when they were first proposing to go into Lothlórien, Gimli, the dwarf, was most suspicious, again because of this ancient distance and difficulty between the elves and the dwarves. And he thought Galadriel might be some kind of wicked enchantress, and they'd all be... So you have two representatives of quite different peoples, people who have some history with each other, some enmity with each other, but being drawn together because there is a far greater evil for them to fight. And you have this moment when Celeborn, the wise, supposedly the wise, suddenly draws on all that buried stuff and says, "Oh, you dwarves!" It was. He doesn't even say it was any of the others. He said, "If I'd known the dwarves had roused this evil again, I would never have let you in." You know, it's a real, as we say, xenophobic. You know, keep the stranger out. We don't want to know. And Galadriel, the lady, answers, "He would be rash indeed that said that thing," said Galadriel. And then she does this really interesting thing. She asks Galadriel, she asks Celeborn and the other elves to imagine if they had experienced in their life and culture the tragedy that the dwarves have experienced of having had their whole kingdom destroyed and taken over by evil and having all been sent into exile and then having a chance at last to look on their ancient home. And she says, imagine it if it was you. If our folk had long been exiled and far from Lothlórien, who among the Galadrim would pass nigh and not wish to look upon their ancient home as though it had been an abode of dragons? So he gets the elf to imagine he were a dwarf. That's an amazing thing in itself. And then she does this beautiful, amazingly gracious thing. She speaks directly to Gimli the praises of his homeland, using all the ancient names of his own time. Dark is the water of Kelad-Zarim, and cold are the springs of Gibil-Nala, fair were the many pillared halls of Khazad-dûm. And Tolkien makes a kind of authorial comment. He says, and the dwarf, hearing the names given in his own ancient tongue, looked up and met her eyes. And this is the key sentence. I think is one of the key sentences in the whole of The Lord of the Rings. Looked up and met her eyes, and it seemed to him that he looked suddenly into the heart of an enemy and saw there love and understanding. It's a moment of healing. It's a moment that makes you realise what the goodness of the good side actually is. People say it's very easy to describe evil, but more difficult to describe good. But this is a moment of pure goodness and revelation, and right at the heart of it. And it goes to the heart of the Fellowship of the Ring, which is in the volume called The Fellowship of the Ring. You know, the point about the Fellowship of the Ring is that they represent quite different peoples, indeed, different kinds of being. There are hobbits and dwarves and elves and men and a wizard. So there's 5 different, if you like, you might say races, but it's even deeper division than that. And yet they're united and they learn each other's ways and they learn to love one another. And one of the great things that comes out of this book later, of course, is the unexpected friendship between Legolas and Gimli. And we're told later on that Legolas goes with Gimli to see the beautiful pillared halls, and Gimli goes with Legolas into the forest, and they learn from each other. It's a moment. It's great in itself, and it has great wisdom, and it's a moment of grace. And part of who Galadriel is. But we read these stories, and you could say this is Middle-earth, it's another world. But Tolkien had lived through many wars and conflicts and learnt a great deal and put all his wisdom into this story. And we read it in every different context. And I mean, I was very sorrowing in a way. I was enjoying the beauty of Switzerland, but even while I was enjoying it, news was coming across of divisions and hatred and riots in my own country, and I've come back into the midst of that. And a lot of it is to do with, if you like, the rashness and hastiness of Celeborn. No, it's the elves versus the dwarves, as it were, and we can see this in people thinking about immigrants or whatever. You can see it in the whole, any notion of racism, really. And it's all undone by this beautiful moment where Galadriel says, what if it was us? Put yourself in that person's shoes. And I think, Tolkien, of course, is a very much a Catholic Christian, and there's no explicit religiosity anywhere in this book. But if you think about the great commandment that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that involves an act of moral imagination. You have to imagine, if you're about to do something to somebody, how it would feel from their point of view, and only do the thing that you would be happy to have done unto you. And we could do with a bit of that. Actually, I have to say, on both sides of the Atlantic, I lament what's happening in my own country. I see what's happening in America. I see how people demonize and hate one another and use the stock response, which is the one that Celeborn reaches for. And then that's interrupted by this moment of grace. And the fruit of it is not simply that she changes Celeborn's mind, but she changes Gimli's mind. Gimli, as it were, has this experience. I think it's one of the golden moments of looking into the heart of an enemy, someone he thought was an enemy, and finally seeing something when there's a friend. So it's extraordinary. I read this book as a teenager because I loved Middle-earth. I loved everything about it. I wanted simultaneously to be a hobbit, an elf, and a wizard, and I saw these as all aspects of who we are, indeed, which they are. But I've come now, after many, many years of reading and rereading, to realise that this is a living source of wisdom, and on its pages are all kinds of things that are extraordinarily relevant to contemporary life. I mean, you can draw your own conclusions and make your own examples, but I've been pleased to see on our news that there are people amidst these riots and throwing bricks and trying to set places alight. There have been other people from both sides of the community who've come out with cakes and sweetmeats and food and refreshments for the poor police trying to keep the line. And, there's beautiful things that come out, as indeed happen in this passage. So, yeah, it's only reading it in this context suddenly makes that whole passage come alive. And you can see, if you read with open eyes, the fruit of this moment, this particular moment of grace where people's minds are changed, both Celeborn's and Gimli's, by the graceful words of Galadriel. You can see the fruit of that right the way through the rest of the book. It's extraordinary and very beautiful. Anyway, it's nice to be back in my own comfortable place, and much as I enjoyed Switzerland, I always like homecoming, and it's good that you've come back and found me here as well. Thanks for coming round. Cheers.